Hi everybody and welcome to week 13. Part 1 of the lecture is on Impressionism. Today we start by taking a close focused look at one of the most important developments in the modern age of art history. It's this movement that we call Impressionism. Understandably, many art history students tire of the laudatory, sometimes sacred treatment of Impressionism. Yet, despite these frequent overindulgences, it is difficult to overstate the significance of this movement. It may be that the independence, avant-garde attitude, and new visual language of the Impressionists were just ideas whose time had come. It may be true that any group of artists anywhere in France, or maybe even in the Western world, could have done what Impressionism did for art at that time, in the late 1860s and 70s. But the fact remains that the artistic innovations of the 20th century, both conceptually and in form, were largely possible due to the first steps taken by the roughly 30 artists that we call Impressionists during the latter portion of the 19th century. Above all, with Impressionism, we have our first fully modern group art style. That is, unlike realism, which was not a group-oriented movement, or unlike Romanticism, during which time artistic life still revolved around the academy, Impressionism was born directly from a group of artists' desire to work independently from an institution like the Académie des Beaux-Arts, as the Royal Academy was officially known. Furthermore, Impressionist artists formed professional and friendship bonds that allowed them to influence and feed off of one another, rather than rely on the Academy or the Salon to tell them what they should paint. Artists in the Impressionist group rebelled against the art world that initially rejected them, and they deliberately broke the rules that were still largely determined by the academies and the Salon judges, well, at least for now. From the 1870s on, these were qualities that were associated with modern artists on the avant-garde. The term modern, as used in art history, refers to the time period from the Impressionist period in the late 19th century through the late 70s or early 80s of the 20th century. Throughout the 20th century, until the end of the modern period, artists would follow the lead of Impressionists. They would work in groups with compatible ideas. They would find new means of representation of reality. They would use form to express emotion. And they would always be trying something new, different, and unorthodox. In the first part of this lecture, as we view works of Impressionist artists, their inspirations and their influences, individual contributions, as well as the way they reflect the greater movement, will be taken into account. While not considered an Impressionist in his early style, painter Edouard Manet is often called the father of Impressionism and was their unofficial leader. Manet's early work was clearly realist in style. Resembling the hard details and harsh lighting of Courbet's work of last week, Manet's paintings did not, however, often venture into political statements that Courbet was so famous for. Manet was born to an upper-class family and, having studied under academic artists, opened his own studio. Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, or The Luncheon on the Grass, is the painting that Manet submitted to the Paris Salon in 1863, and it was the subject of much controversy. Luncheon on the Grass depicted two modernly dressed men with two women, one nude and one only lightly clad. The painting was resoundingly rejected from the Salon for the juxtaposition of a modern nude woman with contemporary men, which was deemed inappropriate. However, as many clothed men accompany nude women in traditional French art, it seems that the nudity was just an easy scapegoat for what were a number of other problems the Salon judges had with the piece. Almost all of these stemmed from Manet's defiance of his academic training, which included when and how to display sexuality, and it seems that this defiance angered and offended the Salon. The figures in this work, to begin with, have a number of issues. The men speak to one another, though they don't even seem to look at one another in the eye. The women are each completely disconnected from anyone else in the group. However, the female in the foreground, modeled by Victorine Meurent, herself an academic painter, is interacting with the viewer. She regards the viewer casually, with no embarrassment nor coyness or sexuality. Nor does she even seem to display her body to us, as in Romantic period odalisques. In fact, unlike the vast majority of nude women in art, she doesn't appear to care about the viewer or any male around her at all. Without some sort of mythological or biblical basis for this figure, her nudity and her expression were unacceptable. According to salon judges and critics, the only possible interpretation of the subject matter was a scene of prostitution in a park, which, though realistic, would have been considered entirely unsuitable subject matter for a salon painting. Yet Manet never supported this interpretation. Indeed, it seems that he collected these odd figures together for no purpose but other than to vex the judges, who wondered at the use of a 7-foot-tall, history-sized painting canvas for this work. The work also has Manet's telltale harsh or photographic lighting, with no visible shadows, common to realist painters. But the group seems to be set in a landscape, with an obscure-looking woods and poorly defined stream or pool in the background. The brushwork is inconsistent and free, and very unacademic in Manet's handling. Many areas are difficult to discern, the dark trees in the background, for example, while other parts, like the basket of fruit in the foreground, are sharply defined. Meanwhile, the work clearly was inspired by two Renaissance-era artworks that would have been known and loved by the academicians of the time. Manet was clearly familiar with the Judgment of Paris by Raphael, as he quotes the central figure grouping from the lower right of the engraving. You can see here. Take a look at that and compare to that. Manet also appears to have drawn from Pastoral Concert by Titian and Giorgione, which you can see here. This is another Renaissance-era piece that not only combines clothed males and nude females, but also features a female figure, also with a slipping garment, gathering water from a fountain. Manet's use of these highly praised works as inspiration would not have gained him favor with the Salon, as luncheon was probably regarded as a slap in the face of the Renaissance tradition. All of these factors of subject matter and technique, as well as the piece's overall anti-academic attitude, led to the rejection of Luncheon on the Grass from the Paris Salon of 1863. But that year, dissatisfaction with the Academy and the Salon was running high, and extended all the way up to the throne of Emperor Napoleon III. Some 4,000 pieces were rejected from the Salon that year, which led to public outcry of artists. Napoleon III declared that all of the works that were rejected should be exhibited in another salon, called the Salon des Refusés, which means Salon of the Rejects or Refused, so that the public could judge the works for themselves. At first, people visited the Salon des Refusés out of curiosity or for a laugh, but it was clear that a number of artists, including Manet, Claude Monet, and James McNeill Whistler, were making interesting, odd, and wonderfully avant-garde art. This exposure of the public and of art critics to the new trends in unacademic painting led to a shift in the Paris art world. From this point forward, though the Academy and the Salon were still very powerful, they were no longer the only game in town. Even by the very next year, the Salon was beginning to see the writing on the wall. Manet submitted Olympia to the Academy's Salon in 1864. Olympia had many of the same issues as Luncheon, but it was even more widely reviled due to the obvious brothel setting. The central figure, once again modeled by Victorine Meurent, looks out at the viewer with a now familiar, disinterested, casual look. She is clad in shoes and jewelry, and lies on a sumptuous but rumpled bed, all of which allude to her status as a courtesan or prostitute. If there was still any doubt, the title would give it away. A very popular play in the seedy Montmartre district had a character named Olympia, who was a prostitute. The clothed woman on the right presents her flowers, adding an edge to the painting, as in France at the time, black people were commonly stereotyped as highly sexual. In general, the painting looks unfinished, with the figure's body lacking much chiaroscuro or shaping, and the background and bed lacking finishing in parts. But all of Olympia's problems were compounded by another element that links this painting to luncheon. It too quoted a highly regarded Renaissance-era painting, the Venus of Urbino. This juxtaposition of a modern-day prostitute with the warmly regarded Venus must have seemed like a blasphemy. At the time, it was mistakenly believed that Titian's Venus was a courtesan, and this fact highlights the subtleties of the Salon's issues with female nudity. In the world of the Academy, the Venus was fine, even perfection. She lay docilely, her face looking welcomingly up at the viewer, her body voluptuous and warm. Olympia, on the other hand, brought the viewer back to reality. Her body is average, existing without intending to titillate the viewer. Her face reveals that she is in control. In fact, her hand was set in critiques at the time to flex in an unattractive way as she protects her genitalia. The black cat arching its back at Olympia's feet directly mocks the sweet, docile dog laying at Venus's feet. Believe it or not, Olympia was accepted at the Académie des Beaux-Arts Salon, to the dismay and amusement of some, while others appreciated it as a sign of the times to come. Some artists took Manet's cue and painted the sometimes seedy world around them, often without a care for academic technique. Despite this shift, the Salon continued to reject a large number of works. Napoleon III did not grant any more Salon des Refusés until 1874, when the Impressionist movement had already gained popularity and the course of art had already shifted toward avant-garde modernism. As requests for further Salons des Refusés were denied, artists realized that their efforts to create and exhibit work in a non-academic environment would not be directly supported by the state. Some artists continued to pursue careers through the Academy and the Salon, while others attempted to form groups independent of the Academy without sanction from the government. Some of the artists who would become the Impressionists, including Manet, Claude Monet, and Pierre-Auguste Renoir, gathered and planned their activities at the Gerbois Café. This loose group of artists was often called the Batignolles, after their Paris neighborhood. These artists and their friends differed from the Academy in their philosophy on art making. The Batignolles, or future Impressionists, preferred to paint en plein air, which means in the open air in French. This is a trait they picked up from their Romantic and Realist predecessors, many of whom sketched out of doors. But the future Impressionists took this concept a step further, and would often paint entirely out of doors. This was not possible for some artists. Female artists would have been proscribed by gender expectations from performing such non-ladylike activities in public. But they were also preferred by others. Degas, for example, preferred to work entirely in his studio. The future Impressionists were also convinced that, unlike academic artists, they painted the world naturally. Part of this naturalist philosophy involved en plein air work, as well as painting people who were ordinary, everyday Parisians. For example, Terrasse at Saint-Adresse, you can see here, and On the Bank of the Seine at Benecourt, which you see here, are certainly not brash statements on par with Manet's Luncheon or Olympia. Yet the fact that the subjects were ordinary, if middle to upper class, Parisians in modern dress and modern situations, was in itself still considered avant-garde, as it was in the time of realism. Aside from these forward-thinking tendencies in method and subject matter, the future Impressionists were also avant-garde in their technique. Although we will see that Impressionists had highly discernible styles, the vast majority of them used some form of style and technique that was sketchy and lacked the minute detail and crisp, clean edges and modeling of academic painting. In fact, most Impressionist artists worked with color and light above all, with little focus on drawing issues like linear perspective, contouring, or modeling a la the neoclassical way or early Romantic painters. Notice how this is quite the turnaround from the days of the Renaissance, when issues of drawing were of the highest concern to artists. Impressionist techniques also include dabbing paint on in separate or broken brushstrokes. This can be seen easily in all of these examples by Claude Monet. Rather than smoothly modeling figures, trees, water, and so on, the surface of the painting is crafted of separate dabs of color placed next to and on top of one another. This seems to be inspired by romantic landscape works like J.M.W. Turner and John Constable, but Impressionists take it even further. Many of their works, like this one, can be easily classified as abstract, that is, as deliberately unrealistic. While Constable or Turner might use the separate daubs of paint on the sky, the sea, the trees, and little else, many of the Impressionists applied this technique to everything, including buildings, and people, animals, and so on. What often results is a painted surface that not only resembles a realistic scene, but also functions as an abstract design crafted of a collection of textures, colors, and values, in a way that no other artist in the West had really attempted before. This is perhaps the most important, or influential in the long run, of the avant-garde developments of Impressionism. As we continue to examine the development of Impressionism, note how our artists fulfill or don't fulfill the style characteristics that we've talked about. A few of these future Impressionist artists, Edgar Degas and Bertha Morisot, for example, were accepted at academic salons over intervening years. But eventually, continued frustration with the art establishment caused the once casual, cafe-going group to coalesce and solidify into an official society called the Cooperative and Anonymous Association of Painters, Sculptors, and Engravers. The society levied dues and charged sales commissions from its members. Although the group has several members who are academicians, in large part it was formed due to the restrictive environment of the academy, especially with regard to exhibiting and selling artwork. But while the society formed for reasons we could say were just as business-oriented as philosophical, it became clear that the society was an organization that could be supportive of unorthodox techniques and styles. The society officially formed in 1873. The group counted among its friends Nadar, a famous and famously avant-garde photographer. In the spring of 1874, the society organized and exhibited its own show in Nadar's studio. Many artists not associated with the society also exhibited. The studio was open in the evening as a gesture to the working class, with whom the society identified, even though the vast majority of them were part of the bourgeoisie. Camille Pissarro, Monet, Morisot, Renoir, Degas, and Paul Cézanne were among those whose works appeared in this exhibit. Among the works by Monet was the famous painting Impression Sunrise. This particular work was of interest to the art critic Louis Leroy. Leroy's critique was highly snarky. He labeled the exhibit overall impressionist after Monet's painting, meaning that the artworks in general only gave fuzzy impressions of what the eyes see. Of course, this comment was intended as an insult, but the society liked it. They felt their work did only constitute impressions of the world. One important aspect of the group's philosophy was that the everyday and mundane could be suitable subjects for art viewers. They did not seek to create paintings that were somehow universal and deeply meaningful on religious or historical grounds. Like the ukiyo-e artists of Japan, with which many of the artists would have been familiar, the society sought to capture fleeting moments of contemporary French life. For that reason, they found the name Impressionist endearing, and it stuck. Although financially the Society's first salon exhibition was in the hole, it was a success for the French avant-garde. It had great importance for not just the Impressionist artists, but also others who were looking for an alternative to the salon. Now let's take a look at some of the individual artists that make up this movement. Claude Monet and Camille Pissarro, two of the artists who initiated this movement, were proponents of the broken brushstroke style. Furthermore, their use of color and texture is highly complex and could be minute, as in Pissarro's wooded landscape, which seems to be made of tens of thousands of brushstrokes. Monet and Pissarro built up layers of paint in a way that conveyed not only the effect of light hitting water, air, or trees, or even steam, but also providing an abstracting texture. Though it's difficult to imagine from only a photograph, the surface of many of their paintings is a riot of texture. While this is an important hallmark of Impressionist art, it is not part of all Impressionist personal styles. For example, Gustave Caillebott's Paris, a Rainy Day has a very smooth texture, but its other elements, including a modern Paris street scene as well as the unusual cropping and arrangement of figures, is very much in line with Impressionist ideals. Monet, Pissarro, and other Impressionists often painted the same object over and over, in different atmospheric conditions and different time of day. After a time, the subject itself seems to be less important than capturing the impression of the light as it hits the surfaces of the subject. The Saint-Lazare train station seems to be more about catching the effect of the steam as the light hits it, through the placement of colors together in orthodox schemes such as purple and yellow. In fact, the combination of a number of colors together, even when those colors aren't apparent in reality, is another hallmark of Impressionist style art. Monet and Pissarro exhibited pretty consistently throughout the Impressionist 7 exhibitions between 1874 and 1882, as did Bertha Morisot. We'll return to Monet in the section on the Impressionist crisis. Over the years, the composition of the group shifted, and sometimes they even referred to themselves as the Independents instead of Impressionists. And when the public opinion shifted in favor of the more avant-garde style, more Impressionists were gaining admission to the official academic salons as well, and as a result, some exhibited less and less with their group. A successful academic artist and salon exhibitor, Bertha Morisot liked the avant-garde direction of the Impressionist group and joined them in their 1874 exhibition. Bertha and her sister, Edma, pursued professional art careers at an early age, which was relatively unusual for women at the time at all, let alone among non-artistic families. Bertha befriended Camille Corot and Edward Manet, with whom she had a very productive professional relationship, the two of them incorporating one another's suggestions into their artwork. It's believed that it was Morisot who drew Manet into the Impressionist Society circle and convinced him to adopt Impressionist techniques such as en plein air painting. Moreau's subject matter reflects her station in life according to her gender and class. Works such as The Cradle, as you can see here, and The Villa at Seaside demonstrate the limitations that society imposed upon the female Impressionists. They rarely, if ever, would paint nude figures for exhibition, or scenes in public areas, such as dance halls and bars of Renoir and Degas. But despite the fact that their subject matter was at least in part based on conventional limitations, Morisot and her contemporary, American Mary Cassatt, both reportedly enjoyed painting their family members and domestic settings. This limitation also, perhaps ironically, expanded the repertoire of the Impressionists overall, and the intimacy of family scenes of female Impressionist artists lent another important perspective to the movement. While we may feel that she was shackled by society in terms of the subject matter available to her, Moreau's technique and style were highly avant-garde. She's considered by some art critics to be among the most outrageous in her technique. In Villa, for example, the composition seems to be made of an arrangement of incongruous shapes and textures. Viewing the paint application itself without regard to the subject matter, the effect is one that is highly active, if not violent. Yet Morisot could also use a very controlled hand, as in Summer's Day, in which layer after layer of wavy, almost electric brushstrokes build up the surface. Pierre-Auguste Renoir, another original member of the Society and the Impressionists, is also an artist who we could say has a distinct style and certain subject matter preferences. While other artists like Monet, Pissarro, and Caillebott seem to prefer wide city or country scenes, Renoir preferred to get up close and personal. He painted people out in public spaces, like at the Moulin de la Galette, which you can see here, which was a dance hall, or in more intimate figure groupings, like in the boating party. His focus, as with Morisot, was on people. The interactions of young people were especially interesting to him, and he painted young lovers in a sympathetic but idealized way. For example, examine Moulin de la Galette, where the figures dance in the open-air park, with the light dappling on them through the leaves in the trees overhead. The dancers all wear modern Parisian clothing, and the setting is romantic but realistic. This is a place virtually anyone in Paris would be familiar with. However, the ladies and gentlemen, according to their clothing especially, appear to be of a higher economic status than one would normally find at the Moulin de la Galette. It seems here, in the boating party and in other works, part of Renoir's impressionistic style tends to beautify and idealize, rather than just reflect the naturalism of what he saw. The figures in Renoir's works also appeal to be caught in the middle of natural, if imagined, moments in conversation, smoking, snuggling, or pining longingly after one another. The spontaneity that Renoir carefully crafted in his paintings is also characteristic of Impressionism, which seeks to take everyday moments of modern life and make them the subject of great art. We'll also return to Renoir in the section on the Impressionist crisis.